Hello and welcome everybody to our I3 lecture series hosted by the Masters in Digital Photography program at the School of Visual Arts. We are thrilled to have photographer Nadia Sablin as our guest speaker. Originally from Russia, Nadia earned a BFA from the Rochester Institute of Technology in 2002 and an MFA from Arizona State University in 2011. She is currently based in New Paltz, New York, where she teaches photography at the State University of New York. Nadia has been awarded by the Guggenheim Foundation, New York Foundation for the Arts, McDowell, the Puffin Foundation, and the Peter S. Reed Foundation. Publications include the New York Times, The Guardian, the Moscow Times, Slate, The New Yorker, American Photo, and the Financial Times. Exhibitions include the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Southeast Museum of Photography Blue Sky Gallery in Oregon, and the Cleveland Museum of Art, among others. Nadia is the recipient of the Center for Documentary Studies Honigman First Book Prize in Photography. Her first monograph, Aunties, was published by Duke University Press in 2015. To my mind, Aunties is the perfect antidote to the cultural malaise of the 21st century. Its protagonists, Nadia's two elderly aunts, stand tall, not against the passage of time, but in its harmonious affirmation. They embody the beauty of a traditional way of life, which prizes self-reliance, solidarity, and a deep knowledge of the natural world. Please help me welcome Nadia Sablin to our lecture series.
Thank you so much, Jaime, and thanks for having me here. I'm going to just jump right into my presentation. And I'm going to start by sharing some childhood photographs of myself taken by my father. And the reason I'm going to do that is because much of my work is informed by my childhood and rooted in this place where I used to spend my summers as a little girl. This is a photograph of me as I think maybe a 3 or 4 year old standing in front of the sign to the village called Alokhovshchina. Please don't try to pronounce it. If you don't speak Russian, it won't work. And you can see from my stance and you can see from my beret that I was very much a city person. And every summer when I got sent away to this village to spend time with my grandfather, it was a little bit of a culture shock. And I'll talk a bit about what effects that had. This is a Google map of where the village is located, just so you have an idea. I grew up in St. Petersburg, and it took about 6 hours by bus to get over to the village where my grandfather spent his summers. This is a photograph of me and my grandfather in the village. He was a very loving, beautiful man who was full of stories, full of love, full of hugs, full of attention for me and my cousins. He was wounded in the Second World War, almost, in the first year of the war, almost right away, and was able to come home to his family. He lost his sight, most of his hearing, and the fingers on one of his hands. But instead of becoming bitter about it, he was a very joyful person. I very, very much miss him still. So when he came back from the war, he realized that he was going to need a lot of help with his family. And so he decided to move his house to a place closer to brothers, sisters, family members. He took the house apart log by log, floated it down a river and rebuilt it. Here it is with my grandfather in front of it. I actually don't know where the dog comes from, not our dog. When I was 12, my family immigrated to America, my family being me, my mother, and my father. And I thought that I would never be able to go back to this place of my childhood. I thought I would never be able to return to it. But in my late 20s, I realized that I could. it took some documentation, it took some research, and it took a year of standing in line to the Russian embassy, but finally I was allowed to come back. And I found that the house was still there all those years later. Now it was in color, now it was real, not a memory. And now it seemed like a place that connected me to my childhood and to my memories and to those feelings that I had in the village. I was really shocked to find the numbers etched into the logs for when my grandfather planned to rebuild the house, to find the moss between the logs that was there for insulation that probably hadn't been changed since my childhood, to find the wallpaper that I remembered somewhere in the back of my mind, and to find that this house transported me the whole of me to my childhood. When I was there, I felt differently. I saw differently. The smells there were very reminiscent of summer days when I was little, much shorter. And this house was now occupied not by my grandfather, who unfortunately died before I was able to see him again, but by his two oldest sisters, my aunts. They lived apart for half the year in separate apartments, but for the warmer half, they would come to this house and spend somewhere between 4 and 6 months together, depending on the weather, keeping up their childhood home, growing vegetables, just being together, being friends together. And I immediately knew that I had to photograph them and that it was going to be an important project for me. Even though I had come just as a visitor, a now foreign visitor, looking at them, looking at their life, I could see the book that I wanted to make based on this place and based on these people. I would spend about 10 days every summer for the next several years with my aunts, following them around, watching them grow their own food, watching them create these beautiful fairy tale gardens. And I was really amazed at how self-reliant they were, how strong. I started photographing them when they were in their late 60s, and I continued into their 70s. And in this time, I watched them build things. I watched them heat the house with wood, bring water from the well. The house doesn't have running water. If something broke, it was up to them to find the materials to fix it and to fix it. They never married, and so in their lives, they learned how to rely on themselves and on each other. And it was really incredible to see this partnership between the two women, a very silent partnership. They each knew what the other was feeling. They each knew what the other was needing, and they were there to help. It was kind of like watching a ballet. They had this way of moving around the space and moving around each other that was almost choreographed. They had been in this house for so many decades that they knew every step. And just as the outside garden was full of flowers and beauty, so the inside was full of patterns, florals, combinations that made me wish that they'd had an opportunity to maybe be in fashion or somehow express their ability to create beauty in a larger way. So it kind of fell to me to show that to the world. Ludmila, the younger sister, makes all their clothes. Here she is choosing a piece of cloth for a house dress. She has huge valises under the bed full of bolts of cloth that were probably purchased during the Soviet times, and cutouts of patterns from magazines from the 70s. So their style is very unique. And while the rest of Russia has moved on, And you can see grandmas, wearing Yankees hats and sneakers. Not so my aunts. They held on to their style and they held on to their self-expression. I would follow them on short trips around the village and into the forests. Here we are walking through some abandoned Soviet infrastructure to go get blueberries. And I could have never guessed that by walking through this Tarkovsky-like zone that we would end up in a very holy place, I thought, this forest. And all those little white leaves that you see on the ground are hiding wild blueberries. The clothing they're wearing here are Ludmila's work uniforms. She used to work in a chemical factory and had some really amazing Soviet uniforms, very fashionable, that still fit. Their quiet rituals were really enchanting. Sometimes I would be drawn into a room where they were by a sound of berries hitting enamel. And I would fall into a similar meditative state, watching them, watching their repetitive motions of cutting off the stems and piercing the berries and taking pictures. When I was little, my aunts seemed very foreign to me. They were strange. They didn't maybe quite know how to talk to children. And I was kind of put off by their seeming coldness. And it wasn't until I was an adult observing them so closely that I began to love them in earnest, that I began to appreciate their quirks, to find humor in their everyday lives, and to form a relationship with them that was very deep. I continued to photograph them for about 7 years. I would come back only in the summer, spend time with them, and then move on to other projects. And of course, with people that age, their decline was imminent. I could feel it, especially in the later years when they started to ask me not to photograph so much, maybe not to photograph them when they felt tired or weak. And the project came to a natural end before Aleftina, the older sister, passed away. And I'm really happy that she was able to see this book. I hope that she was able to understand what I meant by it. I hope she felt the love that I tried to express through each image and through the series. And here's a picture of that book. So my aunts, they'd get tired of me. I'm relentless with a camera. When I want a picture, I can photograph for hours and days. And I think that can get painful, especially for shy people who are not used to being scrutinized in such a way. And so when they would get tired of me, they would send me away. They would say, go away, go shoot something else, go read a book, quit bothering us. And so ever since I started photographing them in 2008, I would also wander around this village and the forests that surround it, looking for my own childhood memories, looking for places where I used to play, looking at it just as an exercise in appreciation, just loving the beauty of the landscape. I was living in New York at the time, and so it was a very different place than Brooklyn, than Bushwick. It was kind of the opposite of that. And while I was taking these long walks, I started slowly making friends with the residents of the village. This is one of the first photographs that I took, not of my aunts in the village. I noticed a little dog that I thought was cute and started photographing over a tall fence. A little girl came to the window with a cup. I thought that was amazing. Continued to photograph through this fence. until the door swung open and the father came out. And I thought, uh-oh, all right, this is it for me. I've been spying through a fence on some children. This is not going to end well. But it ended in a tea party, and it ended in a long-term friendship. Here's a photograph of Alona, one of the daughters who lived in this house. And here's a photograph I took of her 10 years later. So every year, I would come back and bring a print from the previous summer. I was photographing these two little sisters, and I thought how interesting it was that my main project, the two elderly sisters, were kind of replicated in this pair. They are similarly aged, 2 years apart. They're also growing up in a big family in this village. And it was kind of akin to looking back into time and spying on my aunt's childhood. So I came back over and over again, making new pictures, figuring out new ways to photograph and engage with the girls, sometimes convincing them to pose for pictures if they weren't feeling up to it. Sometimes not photographing them if they really weren't just being ordinary, or allowing them to hide in the photograph. And as I was photographing them year to year, I realized that I wasn't just making portraits, that I was photographing time. And here's Alona with her own baby and her husband. The last picture I made of her. This is their brother, Margosha. He was a great guide to the village. Unlike his sisters, who mostly stayed home, he roamed around meeting everybody, and he was very generous in introducing me to a lot of his family, a lot of his friends, and a lot of spider-filled abandoned houses that we climbed into. And he's the other kid that I ended up photographing once a year, every year. This coming summer, I'm invited to his wedding. So as a kid, I used to hate being sent to the village. It was terribly boring. There was no TV for kids, really. It was endless talking heads of the Soviet state. And there wasn't much to do. My friends weren't there. So I would invent these bizarre pastimes to amuse myself, such as counting cows when they passed by, going back to their farm. It's an impossible task because they all look the same, kind of, and they all flow in and out on the roads. I would always lose count, but it wouldn't deter me. I would be back the next day trying to find out how many cows there were. And when I came back, I ran into these cows and I wondered where they were going, because the facility that I remember from the 80s is now abandoned. Here's a photograph of it. And there's actually a sawmill on the grounds where my aunts get their wood for repairs. So I decided to figure out where the cows were going this time, not just their number. And I followed them to this incredible old Soviet, I forget what they're called, sovkhoz. I don't know how to translate that. But here they are, the cows in their home. And I ended up spending some time there photographing the people who worked there, the little still lives that they made. And I met this wonderful person. Her name is Vika. She was 8 years old when I met her. And she's another person whom I ended up photographing for the next 10 years, even though I didn't know it at the time. Vika was living with her aunt and helping her aunt work in this on this farm. And here's my last photograph of Vika 10 years later at 18. She was a mother from the very first minute that I met her. I think she had been a mother her whole life. If she wasn't taking care of a stray kitten, then she was watching her cousin Andrusha. Later, when her mom returned from St. Petersburg with a new son, she became a second mother to him. She was always cooking something or scolding the kids or making sure that they weren't getting into trouble. She was an incredibly giving person. If she wasn't a perfect mom, nobody can be when they're 10, 11, 12 years old. But she was definitely, I think, the caretaker of the family. And here she is with her own baby. She had Elisa when she was 18. Her cousin Andrusha was another interesting character. Unfortunately, the medical facility in the village is not really equipped to handle serious illness. And so when he was very young, he was given some medicine that caused him to lose his hearing. And he was deaf for the rest of his life. He is deaf now. And until he was 8 and got sent away to boarding school for the deaf, he communicated in his own language with signs and grunts and noises. This is Andrusha's mom. By coming back every year and returning prints that I made the previous summer, I slowly earned my way into being trusted by the adults. And it was probably about 7 or 8 years in when the adults became interested in me and started inviting me in to have a conversation and even asking me to take their photographs. This is Vika's mother. She only allows me to photograph her when she's drinking. I tried many times to take a nice day-lit portrait of her, a kind of as a thank you for letting me have this relationship with her daughter. And she wouldn't hear of it, but whenever she's drinking, she won't let me not photograph her. So that's the result of one of those sessions. I became very friendly with 4 families. This is the third one. The 2 taller boys are brothers. And I would come back and photograph them as well, as their house was being built, as they threw rocks at their neighbors. And they were another connection that I had to the village population. So I would follow these kids. I started off by kind of connecting with kids who were the same age I had been when I went to the village. And slowly the kids were growing up before my eyes. Year to year, I would find out that they were all smokers. And then that as they became teenagers, how they would change, how they would fall into these rigid gender roles and try to emulate adults in the way that was available to them. There's a bunch of teenagers sitting on the post office porch. And I would see the divide forming between the kids that used to play together who would now only hang out with their the same gender peers. And also that was kind of the time when they stopped being so carefree. So I started photographing the adults. I became really interested in this transition of what happens to a person in this village, how they move from childhood to adolescence to adulthood and to old age. So I started photographing in workplaces like this hair salon. Best haircuts, $2. I can't wait to go back. How they spent time with their children, what kinds of jobs were available in this town. This woman, her name is also Nadia. She's with her son Max here, and they're both working. She watches a tractor repair facility, and he collects metal. So he goes through all those old abandoned Soviet buildings looking for copper that he can scrap. And what the elderly do, not just my aunts who are different, but the other people in the village. There's a lot of drinking, there's a lot of poverty, there's not a lot of opportunities in this town. It's kind of forgotten. The roads are getting repaired now and everybody's not super happy about it because they think they will become more visible. And to the end of the life. My desire was to see the whole trajectory from being born to dying in this place. In a few years ago, in 2018, I applied for the Guggenheim, and I was very lucky to get it. And that allowed me to spend a whole year in this village. I came in and I moved into this apartment building right here. Our house is not winterized, so I wouldn't have been able to live there when it got cold. Also, I hadn't thought to order enough wood for the stove. And I rented an apartment, and I was really excited to see not just the years go by, but the seasons and the days, and to see how the village functioned when I hadn't been there in the summers. My first stop was a Seniors' Day party where I met the chorus, as I called them. These ladies all belonged to an amateur chorus, and they were celebrating receiving their pension and finally not having to work. I offered them free portraits. They all queued up, and I took their pictures by a window next to a wall. But what I was actually after was pictures like this, pictures in their home. And I was able to get those when I came to deliver the prints I made at the club. So these lovely ladies became my friends, became my muses. Whenever I would get sad, I could just pop over for some tea or not tea, depending on our mood. Russians really know how to party. It was mostly like this, though. We would have tea and bananas, and they would tell me stories. This is Margosha. She told me a story about being in evacuation as a little kid during the war. And the war is very much alive still in the minds of the villagers. It's a very recent event. And so Margosha spent the whole war wearing a potato sack, which was terrible. And she remembers receiving a package of relief aid, and the package had a dress in it, just her size. And she was amazed at how that could have happened. She put that dress on and swore to herself that she would never not be beautiful again, that she would always have something amazing to wear. And so when I came to return her print and photograph her, she insisted that we try on all the dresses that she had, and that each dress that she had to have special jewelry and shoes and a hat. And in the end, I think I was more exhausted than this woman who's in her 80s. But it was definitely worth it for the stories. The stories they told were dark. They were stories that I couldn't have found out without being told. And they're stories that I don't necessarily believe. They knew that this little girl I had photographed some years earlier committed suicide. She turned 17. And they knew which of the schoolgirls had been raped in the abandoned houses. They knew who Andrusha's father was. I had been wondering. They knew which women in the village would bury unwanted infants in the woods in places that nobody would find. And their stories, while often gothic and not quite believable, they certainly put a different mood to how I was seeing this place. This beautiful fairy tale memory was changing to become darker and to become maybe in some way more realistic to how people actually live there, or how they think anyway. Some of the other trajectories I followed weren't people, but houses. This is the old club where people used to come to dance and learn crafts and have dances for people over 40. They let me in even though I wasn't 40 yet. And it got abandoned because a new structure had been built. I'll show it to you in a minute. And I was there when it got burnt down by unknown forces. This is the new building. So much better, right? It allowed me to see what the village looked like, not during sunshine, without the green grass, without all the filters of summer and happiness. And I became interested in the things that were visible to me now, such as industry. Most of the men in the village earn their money by either driving, they're long haul truckers, or by participating in the logging trade. So here are two men off to cut some trees for a new road. Trees are both used for firewood and then also shipped east, probably to China. My dream is to track a tree from being cut down all the way to becoming an IKEA wardrobe or whatever it becomes. There's a lot of sawmills that employ 3 shifts of workers. And there's a lot of migrant workers that come to these unknown villages and work in the sawmills. I met a couple who lived on the premises and who make their own bread and send money back home to wives and children that they barely see. Being there for so long allowed me to come to celebrations as well, not just work. This is Village Day. There's a concert, face painting, also crafts. And photograph some of the more mundane things like the local shop. This is where I bought my groceries. I was there on Epiphany when the priest blessed the waters. And I was there when my favorite house in the village got demolished. The workers actually invited me for the chimney drop. This is the house as it had been. I had a kind of obsession with it, and I would try to sneak up on it from different angles and take a picture with it being unaware of me. And I finally got a photograph that I'd been after since my early 20s. I used to live in Ukraine, and I would hear my neighbors slaughtering pigs, and they would never let me see it. So finally in the village on New Year's Day, I got up at 5 a.m. to go witness this murder. And afterwards, I couldn't quite bring myself to look at the actual moment of the pig being killed. And I chose this one where the pig doesn't know yet, or maybe it does know, but it definitely has an intense connection with the man who's about to kill it. Being there was made me kind of a lazy photographer because I never even had to leave my house to take a picture. I took this one right out of my window across the street from where I lived. And my neighbors were incredibly welcoming and allowed me to photograph them any day that I didn't want to leave the building or when I was feeling lonely. This is Katya. This is from some years before I moved it in the floor above her. And while I was living in the village, the family underwent some drama and trauma, and some secrets came out. And it was a really tumultuous time for them. So I became a kind of professor, friend, place that they could go to get away from each other. Here's another before and after of Sonia, the youngest daughter. This is a summer photograph from some years ago, and this is a winter photograph that I took in 2019. And this is Lisa, one of the middle daughters, on the holiday of Epiphany, when you dunk yourself into frozen water that's been blessed. And in this way, you're cleared of your sins and you're clean for the new year. And you can start anew. And taking this photograph and being there for that moment, it made me understand something about this series. It's another photograph I'd taken of Lisa when she was 9, walking in water. There's something beautiful about this connection with nature, about this physical connection with nature that my friends, my subjects have. This reliance on the seasons, this reliance on what's around them for survival, this reliance on each other, the love, the care, because they have so few things, it becomes even more important. It becomes the only thing that sustains them sometimes. And witnessing that has been an honor and a pleasure. And seeing beauty and hope in a place that has so much poverty and darkness has been an effort, but it has certainly been rewarding. So I think I'm done photographing. I spent 10 years coming back to this place over and over, and I have so many photographs. I'm now in the process of organizing them and sequencing them into a book. The working title is Years Like Water, and is going to have the photographs I showed you and some more besides when it's finished. So that's all the work I'm going to show you today. But I'd love to hear some questions.
All right. Wow, Nadia, so inspiring. Do you? Well, before I ask a question, I just want to tell our audience that they're welcome to submit questions via the chat. And you know, when the questions come in, I'll be reading them out to you, and you can answer them in progress. But I'm happy to start this off, and I was just curious, and you talked about this to a certain extent during your lecture. How did the collaboration with your aunts change over the years? How different was it to re-encounter them for the first time that first summer, and then in the 7th summer, you know, what was that like?
Yeah, it was definitely a process. The first summer I came back, they hadn't seen me since I was 12. And it was interesting to be treated like a 12-year-old by people you barely remember, but also comforting in some ways. I came back with an impediment. I had a camera attached to my face, but they were kind. And I think they were so excited to see me that they allowed for unbridled photography. The first 2 years, I would try to set up pictures. I would try to direct them more. But going back and looking through those, I didn't think that it translated the kinds of feelings that I had about my aunts and about the place where they were. And so I started watching them more and hanging back in the background more and observing more than directing. And it was kind of a push and pull. There were some shots that I just had to have and that weren't going to happen on their own. And then they would sometimes they would surprise me by doing something I would have never expected them to do. So it was good to be present for those. By the end, as I mentioned earlier, they figured out that they could say no and that I would comply. And so they started using that more and more. I think they were a little bit embarrassed at becoming more tired. I think they didn't want to be seen as weak. I don't think they wanted to be seen as getting older. And so I think in the last summer that I photographed them, I took maybe 1 or 2 pictures Whereas the first summer, I shot all my film in a week and had nothing left.
Just in terms of their biography, just to flesh it out a little bit. So they spent summers in the village, but they didn't live there year round, correct?
Yeah, the house would need to be winterized. It would need to be insulated. So in winters, probably around October, sometimes September, depending on the weather, they would go back to their own apartments. And
In St. Petersburg?
no, in different smaller towns. And they would still visit each other over winter, but they weren't living together permanently.
Mm-hmm. And last question, I promised, and I'll open it up to the general questions. But your one surviving aunt, I imagine she's very reluctant to be photographed anymore. Um, how is that working for you after spending so much time with them? Do you just come and visit, or?
Yeah, that's tough. When I came back to spend that year in the village, the first part of it I spent with my aunt in the house, and she just flat out refused to be photographed. She said, "No more. I'm done." It was Aleftina who was into this. She's the one that wanted it, not me. I don't know if that's true, but that was the excuse that she needed. She didn't want to be photographed at all, and so I would just show her the pictures I had taken around the village, and yeah. She said something really interesting to me about photography. Um, she's mentioned something about living in obscurity in the village, and I told her that's not true anymore. Your pictures have traveled around the world, and they've been seen in New Zealand, they've been seen in Colombia, all over. So you're not an obscure person, you're famous. And she said, "Oh, no, they don't know me, they know your pictures of me." And I thought that was really important and true and kind of sad. Yeah, so I guess she didn't want to be part of my pictures of her anymore.
I see. Wow. Tough. I mean, she gave you so much for so long.
Yeah.
I'm gonna be true to my word. I'm gonna read some questions from the audience. Here's one from Logan Bellew. If I mispronounce anybody's name, please forgive me. You said that at the end. You said at the end you're finished photographing. Are you? How do you know that it's finished?
Yeah, I said that I'm done photographing, and I haven't been back to the village in 2 years, but I'm going back in the summer. So maybe I'm lying. I think I'm done. It feels done. I think I've said everything I want to say, but who knows what will happen over the summer. Maybe I'll find a new thread or a new chapter, a new volume. I don't have a definitive answer there.
Julia P is asking, well, she says, thank you very much for this talk, Nadia. I have a question about how do you approach your subjects and how do you interact with them during shoots? Best regards from London.
It depends. I think I try to understand what the subject in the photograph needs. Sometimes they want to talk, sometimes they want to be seen and to be looked at, sometimes they don't want to be photographed and we just end up chatting. I ask a lot of questions. I let people tell me what they'll tell me. I stay quiet a lot. I watch a lot. And if they want to play, sometimes we will collaborate on a whole scene together. With the 2 little girls, we used to go and try on all their dresses and figure out which bed they were going to sit on and where the sun was coming from. And it was a kind of game.
An extension of that question that I'm curious about, and I'm speaking from the point of view of a New Yorker who would love to photograph the children of strangers, but it's incredibly difficult here, and it's almost taboo at this point. because parents are so protective, so protective of their kids. Is it similar in Russia? Was it? I mean, you mentioned that episode where you saw the little girl peeking out of the window, and then the father came out, and you were concerned that you were in trouble. How is it to photograph uh, strangers' children in the village or in St. Petersburg?
I don't make a habit of photographing into people's windows. That was an exception. I'll lead with that. But I always try to make a point of contacting the parents. If the parents aren't around, if the parents are around, I will go talk to them first. And if they're not, I will photograph the children and then ask them to put me in touch with the parents. I'll ask for a phone number, I'll ask for an address, an email, something. If they don't want to give that to me because they're being protective of their homes, I will give them my card so that the parents can get in touch with me. I definitely don't want to steal any children's photos. And it's important to me to form relationships with the parents as well. Especially, coming back to the same place over and over again, you become a kind of member of the community and you want to be trusted. So you follow the rules.
Eugenia D'Ambrosio has a comment. It says, the work is beautiful. It's wonderful to see the relationships that you formed and the progressions. Tom Ash, our department chair, says, thank you, Nadia. This is a wonderful document of your aunties and this village. Could you describe the process of making the first book and compare that with the process of making the new book?
Sure. I won a prize for the Auntie series, the Honickman Prize, that unfortunately I think is done. And I was put into contact with a wonderful designer, Yolanda Cuomo, and her assistant, Bonnie Bryant, who were incredible. They're very, very helpful in getting me to see my work from a different point of view, helping me sequence it, helping me choose what layouts we would have. We talked about what materials the book would be made of. I actually brought over to Yolanda's studio some quilts and some handwork that my aunts had made. And I said, this is what I want the book to look like. And we ended up using a lot of materials that resembled things in the photographs. And like the end pages are actually sourced from the wallpaper inside the house. And it was a really wonderful collaboration with Yolanda and also with Alexa Dilworth at the Center for Documentary Studies, who helped me edit my writing and edit my thinking, and actually came up with the subtitle of the book, The Seven Summers, with Aliftina and Ludmila. So it was definitely a lot of back and forth, suggestions, rejecting some ideas that they had, and learning how to stand my ground on some things. I'm so grateful for receiving this prize that that I probably gave away more creative control than I would now. But without going through that experience, I wouldn't know how to do that and what I actually want. So it was an incredible first experience for publishing a book.
Do you know, Yolanda Cuomo was my thesis advisor once upon a time when I was an MFA photo student.
You.
Yeah. That's tremendous. She's the best.
Yeah,
do you think you'll go back to her for the second book?
I'm working with Bonnie on the second book.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, I took a year off for COVID, so I hope she'll have me back. But
I don't think that's too strange. I mean, we all had our lives interrupted, so hopefully, yes, things get back on track. Here's Kimberly Ruth. In many of your portraits, you seem to be photographing mid-action. based on the body language, but your subjects are often looking at the camera. Can you talk about how you talk or interact with your subjects right before you click the shutter?
Usually each portrait lasts a couple of hours for some of them. Some of them are caught, but most of them, I spend a lot of time with the person and we try different things. I'll shoot 7 rolls of film of the same room, the same chair. It's, I don't know quite how to describe it. It's a short, intense relationship that lasts for the duration of a photo shoot. I look at them intently. I listen to them, trying to really, really see them. And some people really enjoy that. Some people never want it to happen again. And the people that enjoy it welcome me back the following year and we do it again. And so during that conversation, during that interaction, sometimes they will be doing something. Sometimes I'll ask them to repeat a motion, trying to catch it. Sometimes I'll just sit quietly and watch somebody interact with someone else and the picture happens that way. I don't think I have a special trick or way that I do things. I just try to observe what's there and look for the moment that that feels right about that person.
Do you think some of those moments go back to your own childhood? Do you ever, did you ever find yourself taking a photograph in the present that was really a photograph of your past?
I think that the way that I see changes to the way that I used to see in my past. And that actually brings us back to the conversation we were having before this talk started, when you asked whether I photographed in the States. And I talked about mainly photographing in Russia, and that being my preferred place of photographing. The way the sun falls there, the way people hold themselves makes me feel like this wide-eyed kid, make me feel very young and make me see in a different way. And I think in that way, yes, there is definitely a connection to my childhood. In the States, I'm always like, oh, my taxes are due. How can you photograph when your taxes are due? I don't know. How do you do it, Jaime? Speaking
I guess we all have our own tricks. In Guatemala, we're not strangers to drinking. Sometimes that helps. a lot of good photographs happen when you're half drunk in my country. But yeah, I guess you lose yourself in the moment and try to get somewhere else than where you started. I guess that's the mechanism of poetry, right? The other side of this side.
Yeah.
So let's see. We have Maggie. I have a couple of comments. I'm going to skip over comments in the interest of time, and I'm going to go straight for the questions, although the comments are all like very grateful and encouraging comments about you and your vision, and they all thank you for sharing with us tonight. Maggie's son is wondering, have the people in the village ever asked you to show them photos you've taken in the US or other countries? If yes, what was their reaction?
They mostly want to see pictures of themselves. And they mostly want to see more pictures of themselves. Anytime I give them a print, they're like, well, what about the 100 others that you took? I want to see those
right.
too.
Right.
And then it becomes a lengthy, boring explanation for why they don't actually want to see those pictures. They do ask about what life in the States is like, because they all think it's like Friends, and we all live in these beautiful apartments and don't have to go to work. And so I definitely illuminate some of the more, can't think of the word, but I try to tell them what it's actually like to live here for me, for my family, for my friends. And that's very shocking to them. especially when I talk about the healthcare situation and how I couldn't go to the doctor for 8 years, and you know, the terrible things that happen to people because of that. They're shocked. They can't believe it because medicine there is free. As awful as it is in the village, at least they don't go into debt for it.
I wanted to just briefly go back to the question that that Tom began asking, and extend it a little bit further. Are you considering text for your second book? What would that look like?
I've been writing a little bit. I really don't like my own writing. I took a couple of classes. I don't think that I'm as good at words as I am at taking pictures. I haven't been doing it as long. Maybe I haven't had the education. I will certainly include some text. Right now, the way the book is sequenced, it's more abstract. And then in the back of the book, there's an index that explains some of the relationships and some of the family dynamics as secondary information. But I don't think text will be the most important thing in the book. I'd like to lead with pictures.
Okay. Nadia, thank you so much for a stellar lecture. It was such a great pleasure having you here tonight, and best of luck going forward.
Yes.
Yes.
And thank you everybody for listening.